Hi. So this is lesson 5.3, Rules and Fallacies for Categorical Syllogisms. Now, we've gone over a number of ways in which you can test whether or not an argument is valid or invalid, either in terms of memorizing the figure and mood table, or in terms of utilizing Venn diagrams to test for validity. I think the most simplest way is to memorize 5 different rules. And if these 5 rules are not broken, with regard to whatever categorical syllogism you're looking at, then you can conclude with certainty that that argument is valid. The first rule is very simple, which is namely that within an argument, the middle term must be distributed at least once. The middle term, perhaps you'll remember when we talked about earlier, the middle term is essentially the glue that holds the major and the minor term together in the premises. It's that third term that doesn't appear in the conclusion. That term has to be distributed. You can think of, if it's not distributed, it's something like, it's the glue that doesn't glue anything together, right? So the middle term has to be distributed. If this rule is broken, we say that it commits the fallacy of the undistributed middle. A fallacy basically just means any argument that actually misleads you. Fallacies, we're going to cover these in more detail at the end of our course when we look at our chapter on informal fallacies, but fallacies in general are bad arguments. And oftentimes, what makes a fallacy a bad argument is that the premises can be true, but the conclusion is false. And we actually covered that to some degree with our notion of validity, right? So this is the first rule, is that the middle term has to be distributed, and if it doesn't, it commits the fallacy of the undistributed middle. The second rule is that if a term is distributed in the if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in the premises, right? And so if you're talking about the major term, if the major term is distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premises. And if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, the minor term must also be distributed in the premises, right? So, and if this rule is broken, we say it either commits the illicit major or the illicit minor, depending upon which term was supposed to be distributed. The third rule is that 2 negative premises are not allowed. This one's really easy. Basically, if you see an argument where both premises are negative, you can stop right there. Because, and essentially the idea behind this is that if you have an argument where all the premises of the argument are fully negative, it means that you're in sort of a state of ignorance in which you can't actually say something's the case. So you could never have an argument that actually has only negative premises and has a positive conclusion, if of course you have 3 terms. So this is if you encounter an argument that commits this or breaks this rule, we say it commits the fallacy of exclusive premises. Okay, now the fourth rule is that a negative premise requires a negative conclusion and vice versa, such that if you encounter an argument where there's one negative premise, it has to have a negative conclusion. Vice versa, if you encounter an argument with a negative conclusion, it has to have a negative premise somewhere in there, right? So the first 2 rules are about distribution. The second 2 rules are about negative premises. And if this one's committed, there's no quick, nice name, I think, to what sort of fallacy is committed. We'd essentially say that you've committed the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise, or vice versa, drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises if you break rule 4. Now the 5th rule is that if both premises are universal, then the conclusion must be particular. This makes a lot of sense, actually, especially with what we've gone over with regard to Aristotle and Boole, the existential fallacy, modern versus the traditional diagram, or square of opposition. Namely that for unconditionally valid arguments, if you have universal premises, you can't conclude a particular. Otherwise, you commit the fallacy of the existential fallacy, right? So basically, but you can see here that this only really refers, if you've been paying attention to our discussion on Aristotle and the existential fallacy, this really only refers to unconditionally valid arguments. You might have a conditionally valid argument in which you do draw a particular conclusion from universal premises, but this is only going to be valid from Aristotle's perspective. But in general, you shouldn't try and argue like this yourself, right? So these are and this is of course the existential fallacy. So you've got 5 rules and 5 fallacies to learn. And if you can learn to spot them, then you'll do well. And they concern distribution, negation, negative premises and conclusions and that sort of thing. And finally, universals and particulars of the existential fallacy. So memorize them again. So real quick, maybe pause it and try to memorize them, and let's see if you can remember. The first rule is what? Right? It's that the middle term must be distributed at least once. Now what's the second rule? Right. That if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in the premises. And what's the third rule? Exactly. The 2 negative premises are not allowed. And the fourth is that a negative premise requires a negative conclusion and vice versa. And the fifth argument, okay, I hope you got it. It's that if both premises are universal, you can't conclude a particular conclusion. Right? So these 5 rules, it's actually quite difficult to prove that these 5 rules always work in every case, but it has been done. For our purposes in this course, we're just going to accept these 5 rules. And if you memorize them, you'll be in a great position to evaluate arguments without using Venn diagrams or memorizing the figures and moods. Frankly, I find this the easiest way for evaluating validity. Okay? And also learn those fallacy names. Okay, we'll be moving on in our next session. Okay?